Thank you for tuning in to the 2023 Spring Weed Out Refresher Training. My name is Hallie Minzer, and I'm the Restoration Ecologist for the Milwaukee County Parks Natural Areas Program. This slide gives you a basic layout for how the presentation is going to go. I will be spending the most time on number 3, strategies for removal. I'll be discussing spring as well as a couple summer species as well. I will not go into the fall species because I will be covering these for the fall weed out refresher later in the season. So first off, before jumping in, these are some useful county ordinances to know. Any planting or digging requires a permit. You'll need to reach out to the Parks Department to go ahead and do any tree planting, planting of native plugs, that sort of thing. Collecting of plants and fungi, fruits, that is not allowed in the park system either. So I am one of 4 full-time staff for the Natural Areas program, and we do a whole slew of activities. So restoration and invasive species removal, that's a large part of it. Native plantings and seed dispersal. We have a well-established native plant seed collection program that we've been growing over the last few years. We also do a massive tree planting every fall, planting well over 1,000 trees. We take an old agricultural farm out of rotation so that we can go ahead and eventually restore it in the coming decades. Vegetation mapping is another large part of what we do. We have to know where these invasive species are and where our more rare native plants are so that we can protect them and get rid of those invasive species. Wildlife surveys, we do a whole number of wildlife surveys. So we do odonate monitoring, those dragonflies and damselflies. In 2022, we launched our bat monitoring program. We've done butterflies, there's bumblebees, wetlands, all kinds of different programs. We create restoration management plans for the different parks and parkway sections that we have. And community science is another chunk of what we do here at Natural Areas. So we have many different programs, largely those wildlife monitoring programs seen here. So for the natural areas, we are very concerned with maintaining high quality natural areas. When we're doing this, we're thinking not just about plants and not just about animals, but the ecosystem as a whole and how it functions together, all the different moving parts. So we always have these considerations in the back of our minds. We want to do everything that we can to maintain and even increase the native plant and wildlife diversity that we have on site, which really, we do already have really astounding numbers on site, which I will touch on briefly in an upcoming slide. And then, of course, reducing the negative impacts of invasive species is huge as well. All right, Milwaukee County Parks. We have over 10,000 acres of natural areas. These are going to be not the green spaces or the mowed areas or the playgrounds. These are going to be the different types of woodland habitats that we have. We have various grassland habitats, different types of wetlands, all of this. We are fortunate to have 3 state natural areas as well as 2 designated wetland gems, many, many miles of waterways, plenty of ponds and lagoons, hundreds of ephemeral ponds. We are located right along Lake Michigan, so we are along a major migration corridor. And then Milwaukee County is located right, the ecological tension zone runs right through it. And that's just a fancy way of saying that we are at the confluence of more northern species and more southern species. So those go ahead and meet, which basically gives us heightened biodiversity. Here you can visualize some of the different habitat types that we have. And so you can go ahead and pause your video, take a look at those, and how we manage these different habitats requires a different approach for each of them. Some more of our biodiversity by the numbers. I do really encourage you to pause the video and take a look at some of these, and we are finding new ones every single year. Our natural areas do have many threats that they face. Habitat fragmentation and urban development, of course, in such an urban county, pose great challenges. Climate change is another one that comes with a whole slew of problems there. Encroachment, there's issues that we have been tackling with encroachment pretty strongly over the last couple of years, our park staff. Illegal collecting. So right here are wild leeks, also known as ramps, and these have gone locally extinct in some areas because of overharvesting. I've also seen in our parks people with backpacks harvesting, completely filling their backpack with fern fronds dug up completely by the roots. I have included, if you take a look at the park ranger on duty number there, we have been fortunate to be able to hire additional park rangers within the last year. So I encourage you, if you see any illegal activities, such as collecting of these species, please go ahead and call the ranger on duty and let them know. I will say that they are quite busy. We have a ton of land to manage, so please only contact them if there's really pressing concerns. But otherwise, dogs off leash present a huge issue. Feral cats is huge. With their killer instinct, they'll go out and in the US alone, they've been documented to kill over 1 billion birds. So that's actually more bird deaths than are caused by bird window strike fatalities. And these cats aren't even eating their prey most of the time. Sure, they'll eat some of it, but it's just that killer instinct that's driving them. So a lot of that is they're not actually doing it to feed themselves. Deer browse is a huge issue. Many of us feel very close to wildlife, and specifically if we see a deer in the parks, it's a magical moment. Definitely understand that. But we have too high of a deer population within Milwaukee County parks, and they can really decimate our native plants and do a lot of damage to our native ecosystems. And then, of course, what brings us all here today, invasive species. I already touched briefly that we create these ecological restoration management plans for our parks. We really go ahead and collect all of this historical information, background information, lots of details on how the landscape is, the topography, wetlands, all these native plant species that are present, as well as the invasives. So all of that information there, we go ahead and gather it so that we can come up with a realistic management plan for those sites that can make the best impact possible. And we create this on about a 10-year time frame, and then we go back and we revisit them. I'm sure if you're watching this video, you're already aware that invasive species are very detrimental to our environment, but these numbers can just really hammer that idea home. So invasive species are crowding out our native species, but they're also a large contributor to why our endangered and threatened species are declining as well. And they just really have the potential to spread like wildfire. So once again, that's why we're here today. Milwaukee County Parks working with the Weed Out program started by the park people. So we go ahead and work together to stop the invasive species in their tracks. I will go ahead and email a presentation or a PDF version of this presentation for you to go ahead and review in more detail so that I don't have to go into excruciating detail here. But if you're a little bit newer to the program, or if you would like to just go ahead and refresh your memory on these topics, please go ahead and take a look at that PDF in more detail. So expectations of Weed Out coordinators, we do expect a lot from our Weed Out coordinators. We appreciate everything that you do. There is no shortage of work going on there. So we ask you to schedule these events, prepare for them, promote them, all of the stuff down the list here. I'm asking that for this year, if you can submit your spring weed out dates by the end of March, to both myself and to Dana Hansen, the new director of the park people. That would be highly appreciated so that we can get that schedule out there. Event preparation. So like I said, I'm not going to go into all these details here, but if you'd like to go ahead and just make sure that you're ticking all the boxes here to have a really successful event, please go ahead and pause the video, look at this, or review that PDF that I will be sending out. Another reminder, we do have the volunteer waiver. This needs to be filled out every year, so that's every 365 days. It's not the calendar year. We prefer if you could fill out this digital version right here, but if you want to go the old school route and fill out the paper copies, that's fine as well. Just do your best to return them in a timely manner to our home office right there at the bottom of the screen. So thinking about if you have a small group or a large group of volunteers, how you're going to go ahead and set them loose into your area is going to be different, and you might choose entirely different areas within your park to work depending on the group size. So here's recommendations. Tools that you're going to want to use for spring, it's much easier than it is for fall. You're going to want gloves, and if you're using a parsnip predator, you'll need that tool as well as eye protection. And I know that some people can be very resistant to eye protection, but it is going to be for their own safety. So please ensure that everybody is wearing these. Even if they have prescription eyeglasses, they need to be wearing those over-the-eye glasses that this gentleman is sporting. If your site is a little bit more confusing to find, creating them a map like this lovely one created for County Grounds Park can really come in handy so that you're not fielding a bunch of phone calls or emails right before your event starts from people getting lost. Also, it is always a great idea to go ahead and just kind of spell out the kind of clothing that volunteers should be wearing, because I always see somebody showing up in the wrong kind of clothing, some real nice white sneakers or flip-flop shorts. So let them know what to expect and what they should be wearing. This slide just gives you a little bit of a boost for event promotion, so go ahead and reference that if you like. This one's huge, invasive species education. So go ahead and take cuttings or get example plants to show your volunteers before they get started. Have them all gather around. Go ahead and tell them maybe 3 distinct characteristics of the plant and have them repeat it back to you. Quiz them on it so that they feel confident going out there and will be doing the right thing. And you're going to have less quality control in the future if you get them on track right from the beginning. I definitely understand the attitude of wanting to go out there and do as much as possible, but really taking 10, 15, maybe 20 minutes at the beginning to refresh your volunteers, even if they're returners, to make sure that they know the proper way to remove these invasives and how to identify them is really going to save you work down the road. And if you have a larger volunteer group, if you have a dozen or more volunteers as a weed out coordinator or experienced weed out volunteer, you might just be doing quality control the whole time and checking in with everybody. All right, so strategies for removal. We can go ahead and provide you with a map like this if you're interested for your site. I recently found where they were on the shared drive. I had some trouble locating them, but I can give you a map if you don't already have one like this. And this can go ahead and help you decide where you want to work, depending on how many volunteers you have or the level of experience of those volunteers for that particular weed out event. So green star areas are going to be those higher quality areas that you want more experienced volunteers working, or maybe fewer volunteers. And then it goes down the spectrum. A little bit less high quality yellow star and purple stars are the more heavily degraded areas that you can set loose larger volunteer groups or less experienced volunteer groups so that they are not going to be a threat to vulnerable species, maybe some lookalike species. This slide just kind of gives you a little bit of a look into how we are deciding which spots of the park we want to have you work in. So once again, those high quality sites are going to be really important to maintain high quality. It makes way more sense to do a little bit of work in an area that just needs a small amount of time versus going to a highly degraded area and trying to build it from the ground up. The next 3 bullet points on there are all concerned with wildlife, so you can't just think about plants. I think that some land managers have a bias where they think, okay, if we do everything right for the plants, then the wildlife will come. And I don't think that's certainly not always the case. So we are always thinking about plants and wildlife, the connection between them, all of those different factors. Rapid response invasives may be a term that you're familiar with or maybe not. These are basically going to be the newer invaders on the scene, those invasive species that don't have the same foothold that, say, buckthorn and garlic mustard do. And we want to go ahead and try to eliminate them before they become so widespread as some of our other invasive species. And then the last bullet point is always very important. Can the group maintain it? Because it may feel great to go in there and go ahead and remove thousands of garlic mustard plants. But if you only do it for 1 year, that's likely going to make the situation worse because you've disturbed the soil. It's got all of these seeds still in the seed bank. You have primed the soil for, it's even more disturbed, so it's even more prone to invasion. So you really need to be able to maintain the site for a bare minimum of 3 years, and it could be 5 or more, realistically. So there is a method to the madness for all of this. We have charts that we can follow. There is a right time to be removing these certain invasive species. So spring and summer, this is going to be when we focus on the herbaceous invasive plants. Got very nice timelines to go on. So let's jump right into these species. Garlic mustard and Dame's rocket. These are the familiar spring invasive species to a lot of us. Starting with garlic mustard, if you crush up the leaves, it's going to have that strong garlic scent that you can't mistake it for another plant. It's also horseshoe shaped with this basal rosette leaf right here, and it's got this strong scalloping on the edges of the leaves. If you look at the Dame's rocket, it's a little bit less distinct, but it still has very distinct, or it's still got characteristics that you can recognize. So you can see that the leaves are all coming out from a central spot of the plant. The leaves are going to be fuzzy, just a moderately fuzzy, not incredibly so. And then the edges of the leaves are going to have oftentimes this purplish reddish color, and underneath the leaves often has this color as well. You see the plants in this stage, you go ahead and you grab the stem as close to the soil as possible and pull it out by the roots. You'll shake off the dirt and you'll place these plants upside down on a log or in a tree crevice. And the reason that we do that is because these invasive species always have one more trick up their sleeves. So if you put them in contact with the soil, they can actually reroot. And of course, we don't want this happening. So that's why you put it onto something where they are unable to grow. You want them to dry out, basically, so that the roots can no longer go ahead and allow the plant to regrow. Once you get a little later into the season, it becomes much easier to identify these plants. Garlic mustard and Dame's rocket, they're both going to have these 4 petals for each flower. You can see that the garlic mustard, these upper leaves are going to be more pointed, more triangular, and they're going to have very distinct teeth on the edge of the leaves. And then the Dame's rocket is going to have anywhere from white to lavender to a deeper purple flower. The only plant that you could really mistake this for are some of our native phloxes. How you tell those apart, Dame's rocket, like garlic mustard, has 4 petals, whereas our native phlox has 5, so count the petals. And then they're both in the mustard family, so you can see these distinct mustard seed pods, very narrow and very elongated. So once you see the plant flowering and in seed, how you go ahead and manage this species switches up a little bit. So you're going to want to pull the plant up by the roots and bag it up because you don't want these plants to be producing seed. So you get to this point and you do that. If you want to have a little bit less material in the plastic bags, because those can fill up really fast, what you can do is you can separate the roots from the stem of the plant, and you can leave the roots to dry, just like the plants that don't have flowers on them. So the big thing about this is you want to be careful, make sure that you don't allow any flower heads to remain there. So make sure that even flower heads that are growing pretty near the stem, which they can absolutely do, are going to be removed and bagged up. You may be wondering, how come I have to bag up these plants when they're in flower? They haven't set seed yet. Once again, tricky invasive species, they can continue to set these seeds even after you've pulled them. So we would just prefer to be on the safer side to not allow it to spread seeds, because these plants can have thousands and thousands of seeds. And we just want to not have that be all for naught after you spent all this time removing these plants. Here are a couple of the species that you do a little bit later in spring or up till summer. How you treat them is going to be the same way for both teasel and burdock. So basically, don't worry about teasel with the monocarpic perennial there. Both of these are functioning basically as biennial. So these are 2-year plants. How they spend their first year is with these basal rosettes here, those leaves that grow close to the ground, and their whole purpose is to soak up sunlight energy and to go ahead and, at the end of the season, move all that energy down to their roots so that in the spring of the next year, they spend all their energy bolting, so sending up these stems, these stalks, so that they can go ahead and flower and set seed, and then these plants die. So the way that these plants spread is by their seed, not by their roots. So little quick tutorial for identifying teasel. You're going to have these leaves radiating out from this central spot again. They're going to be very crinkly and they're going to be rough. Then they become more recognizable once they go ahead and send up that stem and that flower head begins to develop. So the stalk is going to be very prickly. You do not want to grab that with bare hands. And then it's going to have this oval-shaped flower and seed heads, oftentimes with these modified leaves kind of forming a cage around that flower head. Burdock, if you're a gardener, that's going to look a lot like rhubarb. You're going to have these big leaves with the distinct waves on the outside. They're going to be kind of oval shaped. The stalk is going to be kind of U-shaped if you look closely enough, and it's going to have that purple reddish color to the base of the stem as well. Later on, these plants get even easier to identify when they're in flower and when they're in seed. So they're both going to be this purple color. The seed heads then for the burdock are going to be very recognizable to most individuals. Those are the ones that stick to your fleece coat or your dog's fur. All right, so just backtracking a bit, how you want to remove these plants at this stage is you want to use a parsnip predator, which is basically just going to be a shovel with an inverted V on it, and you use it to go several inches below the soil level to sever the taproot. So ideally you want to do about 3 inches below the soil, which is rather deep. And the reason you do this is you don't want to leave enough root to have enough reserves to send up another stalk. So you sever the root with that parsnip predator below the ground. It's going to make this satisfying pop noise, and then just go ahead and lay down the stem and make sure that you cut it all the way through. Once again, you get to the flowering and the seeding stage, and the method switches up a little bit. So at this stage, you can just cut and bag the flower heads and the seed heads, tie it up in that plastic bag and throw it in the dumpster. You don't have to sever the taproot with these ones when you're removing these flower and seed heads, because this is a biennial plant species, right? So it's not going to go ahead and grow from the roots again. So you only need to remove the flower heads and the seed heads at this stage. And now finally, we've got thistle. This one can really be a lot of trouble to remove, so I empathize with you. This is only going to be realistic for friends groups to remove in small areas, I would say. This is a plant where you're going to want to hand pull it several times a season for multiple years. So as soon as the flower goes ahead and starts to form those buds, that's when you're going to want to go and hand pull it and get as much of the root as possible. The reason you wait until right before it flowers is because the plant's expended a lot of energy from the roots to go ahead and form these flower heads. So the idea is you have taken more of the resources from the plant if you wait until this stage. So backtracking just a little bit again, thistle, those rosette leaves there I think are pretty recognizable to a lot of people. They've got real strong teeth on them and those prickles on there that you absolutely don't want to be pulling with bare hands. Grab some gloves. Otherwise, This species of thistle has the smallest flower heads, and it's going to be a lighter color than most of our thistles. We do have native thistles, so you're aware. So not all thistles are invasive and are bad. If you are unable to hand pull all of the plants in this small area, what's going to be important is to prevent seed set. This plant spreads by both roots, by underground rhizomes, as well as by seeds. So if you're unable to get to all of these, it might be your best bet to go ahead and just bag up these flower and seed heads if that saves you time so that it doesn't spread that way. So this time of year, I went ahead and added this slide because spring, early summer is never going to be the time to control woody invasives by cut stump treatment. It's not going to be effective, and the reason this is because in spring and early summer, the plant's sending all of its nutrient reserves up from the roots to the stems to go ahead and put out that growth. So the way that the herbicide should be going is down, translocating into the root system. So the forces are opposing each other. They're going the opposite direction. That's why it won't be effective. So please never ever be doing cut stump treatment of woody invasive species from April through June or July. That's not to say that you can't work on woody invasive species during this time of year. What you're going to want to do is focus on hand pulling smaller ones that you can rip out the roots entirely, and that will be fine. I've added a kind of a watch list for 5 invasive species. I don't want to overwhelm anybody, but I'm asking if you happen to locate these species in your parks and their newer populations. I say that because we do have some of these species that already have become established in our parks. So I would like only to inform us about new populations here. I won't go into this in too much detail, but if you'd like to take the time to go over these slides to just kind of familiarize yourself with these plants. For a few of them, they do have native lookalikes, so just to be aware of that. Like you can see here, the Asian or the Oriental bittersweet has these fruits all the way down the stem right here, whereas our native one, they cluster all together at the tip. But this is a terrible vine that can just completely take over, like this picture shows you. On the right-hand side, you can see how it can girdle trees and it will just go ahead and strangle them. So if you see an earlier stage of this plant, I would love for you to reach out to me so that I can go ahead and check up on it. Lesser celandine, this is another one. I would say our focus here is if you see it along the Root River, I would love to know because we have very limited populations along the Root River. We'd like to keep it that way. Lesser celandine is an invasive spring ephemeral, so its leaves are going to be out in early spring or late winter, and it'll flower in May and June, sometimes in April. And it can just completely take over. Not the highest quality photo, but this is all lesser celandine in that woodland. This too has a native lookalike, so it can look like our native March marigold, and you can go ahead and look at this in more detail if you're interested. Just because you think it's an invasive species, I still want you to reach out to me before you do any management of these species to make sure that we can properly identify them. Poison hemlock is another really bad species. This one is extremely poisonous. The main way to tell this is it's going to have this central stem that's purple with this spotting here. Then porcelain berry, another invasive vine. How you're really going to tell it is late summer, early fall, when it's going to be having these pastel colored berries. You can confuse this species with our native grapevines. The leaves can be very similar. And finally, the last one is wild parsnip. I've included this one too because if you get the sap on your skin and then it's exposed to sunlight, it can cause some really gnarly blisters. So we want to keep this away from people. This native lookalike can be golden Alexanders here. So here's how you tell those apart. With that, I'll just touch briefly on this, but after you've done all this invasive species removal, of course, everybody gets very excited about a restoration phase of this, planting natives, getting trees in there, or native wildflowers. So if you feel like you're at this stage, please go ahead and reach out to me. This is going to be, once again, that timeline. You're going to be wanting to remove invasive species in infested area for at least 3 to 5 years before you can begin expecting to plant into it with these natives. And this is because you want to make sure that the invasive is at a manageable enough level where it makes sense to get the plants, the natives in there, and that they won't be outcompeted by these invasives. And another reason is you might actually have native seeds in the seed bank that are cropping up that will do some of that natural restoration for you. Design, we're very familiar with this process. We've got a lot of tips for you. We can give you plant recommendations for the species that will work well in your area and how many plants you'll want to fill that area. You will need to work with our Natural Areas program, and the species will need to be approved by us. So like I said, you don't have to worry about all the details. Just go ahead and reach out to me and we'll work through this together. With that, with any kind of digging that's involved, we need notice on this. So if you can reach out to me a minimum of 2 weeks before you want to begin planting so that I can have our parks do an internal utility survey. And then your friends group will also have to call Diggers Hotline to make sure that there's no underground utilities there as well. With that, a final plug. We do have a multitude of community science programs, and this is the data that contributes to our ecological restoration management plans and can help inform where we have your friends groups work. So if any of these pique your interest, a newer one for 2023 is going to be this turtle basking survey. So if you've got a nice camera with a good zoom where you can get those high quality photos of the turtles basking on those logs and ponds, please go ahead and reach out. With that, thank you so much for all that you do for the Weed Out program, and I look forward to seeing you out in the field. Take care, everyone.